Victor stared out the window of his penthouse, the city sprawling beneath him like a glittering web of light. But tonight, it all felt meaningless. The letter from his doctor lay open on the desk, its sterile words burning into his mind. Terminal. 6 months, perhaps less. For a man who had conquered the business world, built an empire from the ground up, and amassed more wealth than he could ever spend, the finality of his mortality struck harder than any financial loss he had ever suffered. He walked to the desk, picking up the letter with trembling hands. Wealth, power, influence, none of it could stop the inevitable. He had always believed that he had control over every aspect of his life, but this was beyond his reach. As he sat down, he glanced around the room, cold and sterile, just like the letter. His mind raced. No family, no close friends, just business partners and acquaintances who eyed his fortune with thinly veiled greed. Who would inherit his wealth? Who could he trust? The thought of leaving his life's work to someone who would squander it felt like a betrayal of everything he had built. An idea began to form, faint at first, but growing with each passing minute. If there was no one in his life now, perhaps he could find someone worthy, someone who valued loyalty, integrity, and compassion. But how? He couldn't simply ask people. No, they would say whatever they thought he wanted to hear, driven by the lure of his fortune. Then it hit him. What if he disguised himself, hid in plain sight within his own company, and observed people for who they truly were, without the mask of wealth and power distorting their actions? It was risky, unconventional, and borderline insane, but it might just be the solution. He stood up, energy returning to his frail body, and began planning. This wasn't just about money. It was about leaving behind a legacy that mattered. And he wouldn't let death take that away from him. The corporate building stood tall and imposing, a symbol of everything Victor had built. Walking through its vast, polished lobby as a janitor rather than its owner felt surreal. Dressed in a plain uniform, with a mop in hand, he blended into the background, invisible to the very people whose livelihoods he controlled. No one spared him a second glance. The once pristine marble floors he had crossed in tailored suits now seemed much colder as he pushed the mop slowly, taking in the unnoticed details of his empire. Conversations echoed around him, executives making deals, employees gossiping, all oblivious to the presence of the quiet janitor. Victor's keen eye picked up on the smallest gestures. Some executives greeted the cleaning staff with a nod, while others barely acknowledged their existence. He noted the ones who were polite and those who seemed to think themselves superior. This was exactly what he needed, an unfiltered view of the people he worked with, away from the pretense of his wealth. As the day went on, he realized how easy it was to blend into the shadows. To most people, the janitors were invisible, mere background noise to their busy lives. But Victor listened. He paid attention to every interaction, searching for signs of integrity, humility, and kindness. It was a strange position to be in, completely overlooked, beholding all the power. The facade of his disguise wasn't without its challenges. His body, weakened by illness, struggled to maintain the physical demands of the job. Every hour felt like a marathon, but he pushed through. This was his mission now, to find someone worthy of inheriting everything he had spent his life building. And then, as he cleaned the conference room late in the afternoon, he overheard a conversation that piqued his interest. Two executives were discussing the future of the company, their voices low and filled with ambition. But it wasn't their words that caught his attention. It was the way they spoke about others, dismissing their colleagues with a casual cruelty that made Victor's stomach turn. He left the room quietly, mop in hand, his mind swirling with thoughts. If these were the people running his company, who could he trust? Would anyone here prove themselves worthy of his legacy? Or was this just the beginning of a journey that would end in disappointment? As the building emptied and the quiet of the evening settled in, Victor felt the weight of his decision. He had committed to this path, and now there was no turning back. Victor's second week as a janitor proved even more exhausting than the first. The physical labor was taking its toll, and his body, weakened by illness, struggled to keep up. But the exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was mental too. He hadn't yet found anyone who stood out, anyone who seemed worthy of inheriting his empire. Until he met Miguel. It was a particularly grueling day when Victor first crossed paths with the young janitor. Miguel was quiet, always working diligently without complaint, and unlike most of the staff, he greeted Victor with a warm smile whenever they passed in the hallways. One afternoon, as they took their lunch break in the small, dimly lit janitor's closet, Miguel struck up a conversation. "You're new here, huh?" Miguel asked, his voice soft but friendly. Victor nodded, taking a sip of water to hide his discomfort. "Yeah, just started last week." Miguel smiled, offering half of his sandwich to Victor, who hesitated before accepting. "It's a tough job, but someone's got to do it." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments before Miguel spoke again, this time with a bit more emotion in his voice. "I've been working here for a couple of years now. It's not the best job, but it pays the bills. Got a lot of mouths to feed home." Victor glanced at him, noting the slight tiredness in Miguel's eyes. This was a man who worked not for ambition or greed, but out of necessity. There was something deeply genuine about him, something Victor hadn't seen in anyone else so far. As the weeks passed, Victor found himself gravitating toward Miguel. They shared more lunches, exchanged small talk, and eventually, Miguel opened up about his personal life. He had a large family, including a sick mother he was helping to support. He worked long hours without complaint, often taking on extra shifts to make ends meet. But what struck Victor the most was Miguel's unwavering sense of optimism. Despite his struggles, he never seemed to let the weight of his burdens bring him down. Victor began observing Miguel more closely, testing him in small, subtle ways. He would leave a few extra dollars lying around to see if Miguel would pocket them, but he never did. One afternoon, Victor pretended to be sick, struggling with the weight of a heavy garbage bag. Without hesitation, Miguel rushed over to help, not out of obligation, but out of genuine concern. For the first time since he started his mission, Victor felt a glimmer of hope. Miguel was different. He wasn't driven by greed or ambition. He was driven by love for his family, a deep sense of responsibility, and a quiet integrity that seemed unshakable. But Victor knew he had to be sure. One act of kindness wasn't enough to entrust someone with his entire empire. He needed to keep testing Miguel to see if his actions would remain consistent under pressure. And all the while, he kept a wary eye on the rest of the company, particularly Elena, whose ambition and ruthlessness seemed to grow by the day. While Victor was building his quiet friendship with Miguel, another force within the company was growing stronger, Elena. As one of the company's most ambitious executives, Elena had her sights set on the top. She had a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue, capable of charming anyone who stood in her way. But beneath the polished exterior was a ruthless ambition that made Victor uneasy. From his position as a janitor, Victor observed Elena closely. She was always impeccably dressed, her high heels clicking confidently on the marble floors as she made her rounds. She knew exactly what to say to appease her superiors, flattering them with empty compliments while subtly undermining her colleagues. And it worked. Her rise within the company was steady and, to those unaware of her tactics, well-deserved. One afternoon, as Victor was cleaning near the executive offices, he overheard a conversation between Elena and another executive. They were discussing an upcoming deal, but the tone of the conversation quickly shifted. "Elena, you really think you're going to get that promotion?" the man asked, a hint of doubt in his voice. Elena's laugh was soft but calculated. "Of course I will. You think anyone else has a chance? I've got everything lined up perfectly." Victor could almost hear the smirk in her voice as she continued. "I know how to play this game better than anyone. By the time they realize what's happened, I'll already be in the top seat." The words sent a chill through Victor. He had dealt with people like Elena before, those who were willing to step on anyone to get ahead. But what made her dangerous was that she was good at it. Too good. She was careful not to make enemies, to hide her true nature behind a mask of professionalism. To most people, she was simply an ambitious young woman climbing the corporate ladder. But to Victor, she was a ticking time bomb. He had to stay out of her sight. If she caught wind of his true identity, Or if she suspected he was more than just a janitor, she would find a way to use it against him. Victor continued his work in silence, keeping his head down, but always listening, always watching. As the days passed, Victor's unease grew. Elena's influence within the company was spreading, and it wouldn't be long before she made her next move. But what worried him most was how well she played the game. While Miguel represented everything Victor hoped to find, honesty, integrity, kindness, Elena was the embodiment of everything he feared. Victor knew that sooner or later, he would have to confront her. But for now, he focused on Miguel, one step at a time. Victor's suspicion about the company's culture deepened as the days passed, but his interactions with Miguel continued to surprise him. Miguel's actions consistently revealed a character rooted in kindness, but Victor knew that good intentions could falter under pressure. If Miguel was to inherit his entire fortune, Victor had to be absolutely certain of his integrity. The tests began subtly. Victor started leaving small sums of money around, in places where Miguel would find them while working. The amounts weren't substantial enough to raise suspicion, but they were enough to tempt someone struggling financially. Each time, Miguel would find the money and, without hesitation, turn it in to the lost and found or hand it to the person who had misplaced it. His honesty was unwavering, but honesty alone wasn't enough. Victor needed to see how Miguel handled more than just temptation. He needed to see how Miguel reacted when faced with adversity. One day, while they were cleaning the executive floor together, Victor faked an injury. He exaggerated his frailty, feigning dizziness and dropping to his knees with the weight of a trash bag. Miguel immediately rushed to his side, his face etched with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, helping Victor to his feet. "You should sit down. I'll take care of this." No, Victor said, playing the part. "I'm fine. I just need a minute." Miguel wouldn't hear of it. He insisted on taking over Victor's duties for the rest of the shift, even though it meant staying late and doing extra work. For the next few days, he kept a close eye on Victor, making sure he wasn't pushing himself too hard. Each act of kindness, each display of selflessness, reinforced Victor's growing belief that Miguel was the right person to inherit his empire. But as the tests grew more challenging, so too did the risks. If Miguel caught on to what Victor was doing, it could shatter the trust they had built. And then there was Elena, whose ambition and cunning were becoming more dangerous with each passing day. Victor's health, too, was becoming a concern. He had begun coughing more frequently, and the effort of maintaining his janitorial duties was taking its toll. But he couldn't stop now, not when he was so close to finding the person he had been searching for. He decided to raise the stakes. His next test would be more personal, more emotionally taxing, and it would show him exactly what kind of man Miguel really was. While Victor was busy testing Miguel, Elena was growing more suspicious by the day. She had noticed the janitor, the quiet, unassuming man who always seemed to be around but never said much. At first, she hadn't paid him any attention, but lately, something about him had caught her eye. He was always in the right place at the right time, always watching. Elena wasn't the type to let things slide. Her ambition had taught her that power was never given, it was taken. And if there was something going on beneath the surface, she intended to find out what it was. She started paying closer attention to the janitor, observing his movements, tracking his patterns. One evening, after most of the staff had gone home, Elena stayed late, pretending to finish some paperwork. She watched as Victor cleaned the office, moving quietly from desk to desk, his eyes scanning the room in a way that seemed too deliberate. He wasn't just cleaning, he was watching, listening. But to what end? The pieces began to fall into place in Elena's mind. The janitor wasn't who he appeared to be. Maybe he was a corporate spy, or maybe he was gathering dirt on executives for some unknown reason. Whatever the case, Elena was determined to find out. She approached him casually as he worked, her voice smooth and sweet as honey. "Hey," she said, leaning against one of the desks. "I've seen you around a lot lately. You're pretty quiet, aren't you?" Victor, not wanting to draw attention, simply nodded, mumbling something about keeping his head down and doing his job. Elena wasn't satisfied. "You know it's strange," she continued, her eyes narrowing. You always seem to be in the right place at the right time. Almost like you're listening to what's going on. Are you sure you're just a janitor?" Victor's heart skipped a beat, but he maintained his composure. "I just clean the floors," he said, trying to deflect. Elena smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Right. Well, if you ever hear anything interesting, you let me know, okay?" Victor nodded again, his mind racing. He had to be more careful. Elena was sharp, and if she discovered his true identity, she would use it against him. But he couldn't back down now. Not when he was so close to finding out if Miguel was truly worthy. As Elena walked away, Victor's thoughts turned to Miguel. The next test was approaching, and this time, it would involve more than just small acts of honesty. He needed to see how Miguel would handle betrayal, how he would react when the people around him turned against him. And with Elena sniffing around, the stakes were higher than ever. Victor's observations of Miguel were painting a clear picture of the man's character, but the weight of his illness was becoming harder to ignore. His coughing fits had grown more frequent, and the exhaustion of his double life was wearing him down. Yet he couldn't stop, not when he was on the verge of making the most important decision of his life. One afternoon, as Victor was resting after a particularly difficult shift, he overheard a conversation that sent a shock through his system. Miguel was speaking to another janitor, and though Victor was in the next room, the words carried through the thin walls. "I'm thinking of leaving," Miguel said, his voice tinged with sadness. "My mother's health isn't improving, and I need to go back home to take care of her." Victor felt his heart sink. Miguel was planning to leave. After all the effort Victor had put into testing his integrity, was he about to lose the one person he thought worthy of inheriting his empire? Panic set in as he realized that Miguel's departure would derail everything. Without Miguel, he would have to start his search all over again, and with his health deteriorating, time was not on his side. But beyond the fear of losing his potential heir, there was a deeper sense of loss. Over the past weeks, Victor had come to genuinely care for Miguel. He wasn't just testing him for the sake of his legacy. He had grown to admire the man's integrity, his selflessness, and his unwavering devotion to his family. Miguel's departure would be a personal loss, as much as a setback to his plans. Victor knew he had to act quickly, but how could he convince Miguel to stay without revealing his true identity? The thought of telling Miguel everything terrified him. Would Miguel feel betrayed, knowing he had been tested all along? Or worse, would he see Victor as just another wealthy man trying to manipulate those around him? As the days passed, Victor's mind raced with possible solutions. He couldn't let Miguel leave, not when he had finally found someone he believed in. But every option seemed to lead back to the same conclusion. He would have to reveal the truth. He would have to trust Miguel with the full extent of his secret. The time for subtlety was over. Victor made his decision. Just as Victor was preparing to confront Miguel with the truth, Elena made her move. For weeks, she had been watching both Victor and Miguel, growing more suspicious with each passing day. Her ambition had reached its peak, and she was no longer content with quietly climbing the corporate ladder. She wanted power, and she wanted it now. Her plan was simple but devastatingly effective. Using her connections within the company, Elena orchestrated a situation where Miguel would appear to be embezzling company funds. It wasn't hard. She had planted enough evidence to make it look convincing, and once the accusations started flying, the company's management wasted no time in taking action. Miguel was called into a meeting with the board, blindsided by the accusations. His face was a mix of shock and confusion as the charges were laid out before him. False documents, forged signatures, all pointing to him as the culprit. "I didn't do this," Miguel said, his voice trembling with disbelief. "I would never." But the evidence was damning, and no one seemed to care about his protests. As the meeting ended, Miguel was placed on immediate suspension, pending further investigation. He walked out of the boardroom in a daze, his world crumbling around him. Victor, who had watched the entire scene unfold from a distance, felt a surge of anger and helplessness. He knew this was Elena's doing, but how could he prove it? Revealing his identity might clear Miguel's name, but it would also expose Victor's secret and risk everything he had worked for. That night, as Victor sat alone in the janitor's closet, The weight of the situation pressed down on him. He had wanted to test Miguel's integrity, but this was beyond anything he had anticipated. Miguel was being framed, and unless Victor acted, the man's life could be ruined. The next day, Victor found Miguel sitting in the break room, staring blankly at the table in front of him. His usual optimism and kindness were gone, replaced by a deep sense of betrayal and despair. Victor sat down across from him, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what he had to do. "Miguel," Victor began, his voice low and steady, "I know you didn't do it." Miguel looked up, his eyes filled with confusion. "How could you know that?" Victor hesitated, the weight of his secret pressing down on him. This was it, the moment he had been dreading. "Because I'm not who you think I am," he said quietly. "I'm Victor Jale." For a moment, there was only silence. Miguel blinked, trying to process what he had just heard. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I own this company," Victor continued. "I've been watching you, testing you. Everything that's happened over the past few weeks, it was all part of a plan to find someone I could trust with my legacy. And you're that person." Miguel stared at him, stunned. The betrayal he had felt just moments ago was now replaced by a different kind of disbelief. "You've been testing me?" he asked, his voice rising in anger. "All this time, I thought you were my friend." "I am your friend," Victor said, his voice pleading. "I never wanted to hurt you. I needed to be sure. But now I need your help. Elena is the one who set you up. She's trying to destroy you, and I can't stop her alone." Miguel stood up, his fists clenched. "I can't believe this," he muttered, shaking his head. "You've been lying to me, and now you want me to help you?" Victor felt a wave of desperation wash over him. "I know I've betrayed your trust, but please, Miguel, you're the only one who can save this company. You're the only one who can stop her." Miguel turned to leave, his face a mask of fury and hurt. But as he reached the door, he paused, his hand resting on the handle. For a long moment, he stood there, his back to Victor. Then, without turning around, he spoke in a low, determined voice. "I'll think about it." The tension between Victor and Miguel hung in the air long after their conversation. Days passed, and Miguel kept his distance, struggling to reconcile the friendship he thought they had with the truth of Victor's deception. It wasn't just that Victor had lied. It was a realization that Miguel had been part of a test, a grand scheme orchestrated by a man who had everything but trust. Yet, despite the hurt and betrayal, Miguel couldn't shake the feeling that Victor was telling the truth about Elena. He had seen how ruthless she could be, and wasn't hard to believe that she had framed him to clear her path to power. But could Miguel really forgive Victor for using him like this? And more importantly, could he rise above the situation to save the company and his own future? Victor, for his part, spent the days in agony. His health was worsening by the day, and the guilt of his manipulation weighed heavily on him. He knew he had to find a way to make things right with Miguel before it was too late. But how? Words alone wouldn't be enough. He needed to show Miguel that his intentions had always been good, even if his methods were flawed. One evening, after the building had emptied, Victor found himself sitting alone in the office. The soft glow of the city's lights reflected off the windows as he coughed, the sharp pain in his chest reminding him that time was running out. He could feel the end approaching, and with it, the need to fix what he had broken. That night, Miguel returned. His expression was unreadable as he walked into the room, but his presence alone was enough to give Victor a glimmer of hope. "I've thought about it," Miguel said, his voice calm but firm. "And I've decided that I'll help you, but only because I want to stop Elena from ruining this company. I'm not doing it for you." Victor nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "I don't expect your forgiveness," he said softly. "I know I've done wrong by you, but together, we can stop her. We can save the company." Miguel didn't respond immediately. He simply pulled out a chair and sat across from Victor, signaling his willingness to move forward. The room fell into a tense silence, but the decision had been made. They would confront Elena together, but the fragile bond between them was far from ended. With Miguel on board, The plan to expose Elena was set in motion. They worked late into the night, reviewing documents, tracing emails, and gathering evidence that would prove her involvement in the embezzlement scheme. It was a delicate operation. One wrong move, and Elena would catch wind of what they were doing. But Victor and Miguel worked efficiently, knowing that this was their last chance to stop her. As they pieced together the puzzle, Miguel remained distant, his emotions carefully guarded. He had agreed to help, but the trust between him and Victor was still fractured. Every now and then, Victor would catch Miguel glancing at him with a look of quiet resentment, a reminder of the damage that had been done. But as the evidence piled up, their focus shifted to the task at hand. The truth about Elena was even worse than they had imagined. Not only had she framed Miguel, but she had been siphoning company funds for months, using her influence to cover her tracks. She was planning to leave the company with millions, leaving behind a trail of destruction. The plan was simple: confront Elena with the evidence and give her a choice: resign quietly or face public disgrace. But as Victor and Miguel prepared for the final showdown, Victor's health took a sharp turn for the worse. His coughing fits became more violent, and his body was weakening rapidly. There was no hiding it anymore. He was dying, and Miguel knew it. "Are you going to make it through this?" Miguel asked one evening as they finalized the last details of their plan. Victor looked at him, his face pale and drawn. "I don't know," he admitted, "but this is something I have to do. I can't let her destroy everything I've built." Miguel's expression softened for the first time in days. Despite the anger he still felt toward Victor, he couldn't help but respect the man's determination. Victor wasn't just trying to save his company. He was trying to right his wrongs, to leave behind a legacy that meant something. The night before the confrontation, Victor sat down with Miguel one last time. "When this is over, the company will be yours," he said quietly. "I've put everything in place. You're the only one I trust to lead it the way it should be led." Miguel stared at him, his emotions swirling. "I don't want your money," he said. "I never did." Victor smiled faintly. "I know. That's why you deserve it." The words hung between them, heavy with the weight of the past weeks. For the first time, Miguel saw the depth of Victor's intentions. This wasn't about money or power. It was about trust, legacy, and the need for redemption. The following morning, they confronted Elena. Armed with the evidence they had gathered, Victor and Miguel stood before her in the boardroom, laying out the full extent of her crimes. Elena's face shifted from shock to fury as she realized she had been outmaneuvered. "You think you can stop me?" she spat, her eyes flashing with rage. "I've already won. This company will fall apart without me." But Victor remained calm. "The company doesn't need you, Elena. It needs people like Miguel. People with integrity. People who care." Elena's expression twisted in anger, but she knew it was over. The evidence was undeniable, and her career was finished. She stood in silence as Victor handed her a resignation letter. Without another word, she signed it and walked out of the boardroom, defeated. As the door closed behind her, Miguel let out a long breath. It was over. Elena was gone, and the company was safe. But the victory was bittersweet. Victor, exhausted from the confrontation, collapsed into a chair, his body shaking with another violent cough. Miguel rushed to his side, his anger toward the man finally fading in the face of his frailty. "You did it," Miguel said quietly, his voice full of a new kind of respect. "You saved the company." Victor smiled weakly, his breath labored. "We did it," he corrected. But as Miguel looked down at the man who had once been a towering figure of power and control, he realized that this wasn't just about saving the company. It was about saving something far more important: Victor's humanity. Victor passed away 2 weeks after the confrontation with Elena. His body, worn down by illness, had fought as long as it could, but in the end, it had given out. Miguel was at his side in the hospital when he drew his last breath, holding his hand, offering the kind of comfort that words could never convey. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the machines that now confirmed what Miguel had already known. Victor was gone. In the days following Victor's death, the weight of responsibility settled heavily on Miguel's shoulders. He had inherited the company, just as Victor had promised, and now the future of the empire rested in his hands. But with that responsibility came something else, a sense of purpose. Miguel wasn't interested in wealth or power for himself, but he knew that he had the opportunity to shape the company into something different, something that honored Victor's final wishes. The funeral was a small, private affair, attended only by a few close colleagues and those who had worked closely with Victor over the years. Miguel stood quietly by the grave as the casket was lowered into the ground, reflecting on the strange journey that had brought him here. He had never imagined that his life would take this turn, that he would go from being a janitor to the heir of a billion-dollar empire. But more than the wealth, it was Victor's trust that had left the deepest impact. After the service, Miguel returned to the office, stepping into the boardroom where it had all begun. The weight of the room, with its polished wood table and high-back chairs, felt different now. This was his space, his responsibility. But he wasn't alone. The people who worked for the company, the ones Victor had overlooked, were now depending on him to lead with integrity, to carry forward a legacy that Victor had entrusted to him. The first few weeks were challenging. There were board members who doubted Miguel's ability to lead, executives who questioned why Victor had chosen him, and employees who didn't understand what had happened behind the scenes. But Miguel approached each challenge with the same quiet determination that had carried him through his years of hardship. He met with each department, listened to the concerns of the workers, and slowly began to implement the changes Victor had spoken about in his final days. Miguel restructured the company's policies to focus more on ethical practices, ensuring that workers at every level were treated with respect and fairness. He set up a foundation in Victor's name, dedicated to supporting underprivileged communities and providing opportunities for those in need. And though he was now the head of a powerful corporation, Miguel never forgot where he came from. He continued to live humbly, using the wealth he had inherited to make a difference, not just for himself, but for others. One afternoon, months after Victor's passing, Miguel sat at his desk, looking out over the city skyline. The empire that Victor had built was now his, but it wasn't the buildings or the bank accounts that mattered. It was the people, the relationships, and the impact they had on the world. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and one of the company's senior managers stepped in. "Mr. Miguel, there's something you should see," he said, holding out a file. Miguel opened it, scanning the contents. It was a proposal for a new charitable initiative, one that would expand the foundation's reach even further. He smiled, recognizing the potential it held. "Let's make it happen," he said, handing the file back. As the manager left, Miguel leaned back in his chair, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. Victor had given him the tools to build something meaningful, and now it was up to him to ensure that legacy endured. The memory of Victor's final words echoed in his mind. "You're the only one I trust to lead it the way it should be led." And Miguel knew, with absolute certainty, that he would honor that trust. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Your support helps us continue creating more incredible stories like this one. But we want to hear from you. What part of the story impacted you the most? Was it Victor's journey of redemption, Miguel's rise from janitor to heir, or maybe the confrontation with Elena? Leave a comment below and let us know your thoughts. We're also open to your ideas. Is there a story you'd love to see brought to life on this channel? Whether it's a gripping tale of love, loss, mystery, or betrayal, drop your suggestions in the comments, and who knows, it might just be our next big story.